Your brain hates uncertainty, so when a story offers a clean explanation for messy reality, it feels like relief, even if the evidence is shaky. That's why consciousness changes reality stories spread so fast. They give smart people a sense of control. But here's the twist. This one starts with a real engineer, not a guru. His name was Itzhak Bentov. He built medical devices, held patents, and tried to describe consciousness like a system you could measure. Then he died on American Airlines Flight 191 in 1979, officially a mechanical failure accident. After that, a declassified CIA report appeared years later, echoing some of the same language people associate with his ideas. So, what's actually true here? And what's just a story that feels true? Let's separate the engineering from the mythology. There's a weird pattern in modern life. The more educated someone is, the easier it can be to trap them with a story that sounds technical. Not because they're dumb, because they're trained to respect systems. If you give the brain a system, a diagram, a frequency, a mechanism, a timeline, it feels like solid ground. It feels like the story has bones. And consciousness controls reality stories are built like that on purpose. They use a specific recipe. First, a credible protagonist, an engineer, a scientist, someone with patents, someone who isn't selling crystals or speaking in poetry. In this case, people point to Itzhak Bentov, a real inventor with a technical background. Second, a measurable-sounding trigger, a number, a frequency, a sweet spot, 7 Hertz, Earth's resonance, brain synchronization. Numbers create emotional certainty. You can almost feel your mind relaxing because it's not floating anymore. It has an anchor. Third, a missing folder, a plane crash, a vanishing manuscript. When information disappears, the brain fills the gap with intention. It's not just lost, it becomes taken. Bentov did die in the crash of American Airlines Flight 191 in 1979. That part is real history. But research vanished is where the story leaves the world of records and enters the world of narrative gravity. Fourth, an institutional shadow. The CIA, a declassified report. The feeling of forbidden knowledge. The Gateway Process document is real and publicly available, and it became cultural gasoline because it reads technical enough to feel like confirmation. Here's the key point. A declassified document can be real without making every interpretation of it true. A real plane crash can happen without being a planned removal. A real inventor can speculate without proving the most extreme claims people attach to him later. So what's the psychological mechanism behind why this is so persuasive? Your brain is a prediction machine. It constantly asks, what model explains what I'm experiencing? When life feels chaotic, stress, money pressure, information overload, the brain becomes hungry for an explanation that restores control. And the most seductive explanations aren't the loud ones. They're the ones that say, you aren't confused, you're waking up. You aren't overwhelmed, you're seeing the hidden system. You don't need to change the world, you just need to change your frequency. That last one is the emotional hook, a promise of power without the pain of complexity. And the danger isn't that everything in these stories is false. The danger is that one or two useful truths, like your nervous system state changes your perception and decisions, get used as a bridge to claims that aren't earned. In the next chapter, we'll do something most videos avoid. We'll separate 3 layers: what Bentov actually was and wasn't, what the physiology can reasonably support, where the story starts using science language as costume. Before we talk about what Bentov claimed, we need to be precise about who he actually was, not the internet version, not the myth, the real person. Itzhak Bentov was an engineer and inventor. He held multiple patents and helped develop medical devices that are still foundational in modern cardiology, including early work related to cardiac catheter technology. That matters because it explains how he thought. He didn't think in symbols. He didn't think in beliefs. He thought in mechanisms. When Bentov talked about consciousness, he wasn't asking spiritual questions like, "Who am I?" He was asking engineering questions like, what is moving, what is oscillating, what is transmitting information, what can be measured. That mindset is why his ideas still sound convincing decades later. They're framed like system diagrams, not sermons. But here's the first boundary we need to draw. Being an excellent engineer in one domain does not automatically make someone correct when they move into another. This happens all the time in history. A physicist makes claims about biology. A biologist makes claims about economics. A software engineer makes claims about society. The language stays precise. The confidence stays high, but the evidentiary standards quietly drop. Bentov never claimed to be a prophet. In fact, he often emphasized that his models were provisional, ways of thinking, not final truth. But once ideas leave the mouth of a careful person and enter public culture, they mutate. Subtle hypotheses become bold statements. Careful metaphors become literal claims. Exploratory models become, "he proved." And this is crucial. Bentov worked before modern neuroscience tools existed. No fMRI, no large-scale EEG databases, no computational modeling of brain networks. He was trying to describe internal experience using the best mechanical metaphors available at the time. That doesn't make him foolish. It makes him historically situated. Now let's talk about the most misunderstood part of his work, frequency. Bentov used oscillations and resonance because the body does involve rhythmic processes, heart rate, breathing, neural firing patterns. That part is uncontroversial. What is controversial is the leap from rhythms influence perception and attention to specific frequencies connect consciousness to external reality. That jump feels small when you're inside the story, but scientifically it's enormous, because internal coherence does not automatically imply external influence. Your nervous system can become more regulated, your perception can become clearer, your reactions can slow down. All of that is real, observable, and useful. But none of it requires consciousness to leave the body, access hidden dimensions, or override physical causality. And Bentov himself was often far more careful than the versions of his ideas circulating now. The myth version needs him to be certain. The real Bentov was curious. So why does this distinction matter? Because if you don't separate the man from the mythology, you end up either worshipping or dismissing him. And both reactions miss the point. In the next chapter, we'll look directly at the physiology, what brain rhythms actually do, what 7 Hertz really represents in neuroscience, and why the number feels more magical than it is. That's where the story starts to clarify, and where the useful parts survive. What brain rhythms actually do, and why 7 Hertz sounds bigger than it is. Let's slow this down and strip away the drama. Your brain does not run on one frequency. It never has. What neuroscientists call brain waves aren't waves in the radio sense. They're patterns, statistical rhythms that emerge when millions of neurons fire together. Think of it like this. A stadium crowd doesn't move as one object, but from far away you can still see a rhythm. That's what EEG measures. Delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma. These aren't switches, they're states of dominance. At any moment your brain is using several at once. So where does 7 Hertz come in? 7 Hertz sits near the border between high theta and low alpha. That region is associated with relaxed attention, reduced sensory noise, internal focus, daydreaming and light meditation, improved access to memory and pattern recognition. This is not controversial. What is controversial is the story layered on top of it. Because here's the grounded truth: when people slow down, breathe rhythmically, and reduce sensory input, their nervous system becomes more coherent. Heart rate variability improves, muscle tension drops, attention stabilizes. That alone can feel profound, especially to people who normally live in stress and cognitive overload. And when perception sharpens, the mind often interprets that clarity as, "I'm seeing more reality." But clarity is not the same as expansion into hidden dimensions. It's often just less internal noise. This is where stories begin to inflate. A regulated nervous system notices more subtle cues, reads social situations better, catches inconsistencies faster, feels intuition more clearly. To the person experiencing it, that can feel almost supernatural. But it doesn't require Earth's magnetic field, planetary resonance, consciousness leaving the body, non-local information access. Those ideas arrive later, not from measurement, but from interpretation. And interpretation is shaped by culture. In the 1970s, systems language was dominant. Cybernetics, feedback loops, resonance, oscillation. Bentov was using the metaphors of his time. Today, we'd talk about predictive processing, neural efficiency, signal-to-noise ratio, attentional gating. Different words, same core insight. Here's the key distinction most videos avoid. A calm, coherent nervous system improves perception. That's solid. Improved perception feels like expanded consciousness. That's subjective. Expanded consciousness altering external reality. That's a belief, not a measurement. Once you understand that layering, the spell breaks, but the value doesn't disappear. You can keep the useful part without swallowing the myth. And this matters because when people conflate internal clarity with cosmic power, two bad things happen. Some inflate their sense of certainty. Others reject the entire idea as nonsense. Both miss the middle ground. In the next chapter, we'll look at the event that locked this story into cultural memory, the plane crash, and why human brains cannot leave unexplained deaths alone. That's where psychology takes over from physiology. The plane crash problem, why the brain refuses random endings. Here's something uncomfortable about the human mind. It hates unfinished stories more than it hates bad news. When someone dies randomly, the brain doesn't just grieve. It searches, not for fact, for meaning. And that's exactly what happened after the crash. American Airlines Flight 191 was a real documented aviation disaster, mechanical failure, maintenance error, a known design vulnerability. Investigations were public, conclusions were mundane, and that's the problem. A boring explanation feels emotionally inadequate when the person who died felt important. Bentov wasn't a celebrity, he wasn't a politician, but to a certain audience he represented something rare. A technical mind talking about consciousness. So when he died suddenly, the story didn't end cleanly. And when a story doesn't end cleanly, the brain does what it always does. It completes the pattern. This is called narrative closure bias. The mind assumes if the ideas felt big, the ending must be big. If the work felt dangerous, the death must be intentional. If knowledge feels threatening, power must be involved. Random failure doesn't satisfy that equation. Now add one more ingredient. Years later, a CIA document becomes public. Technical language, consciousness, altered states, systems thinking. To a pattern-seeking brain, that looks like confirmation. Even if the document never mentions Bentov's death, never implies removal, never suggests sabotage. But human reasoning doesn't work like a courtroom. It works like a story engine. If A feels connected to B, the mind draws a line, and once that line exists, every missing detail becomes evidence. Unrecovered papers? Proof of suppression. Similar language? Proof of appropriation. Official explanations? Proof of a cover story. But here's the grounding principle. Absence of evidence does not become evidence just because the story feels incomplete. Plane crashes don't need villains. They need stress fractures, bad protocols, and gravity. And yet, and this is important, understanding why people believe the darker version doesn't mean calling them foolish. It means recognizing that humans trust stories more than statistics. Mystery feels more honest than randomness. Control feels safer than chaos. The conspiracy isn't always about power. Often, it's about emotional coherence. And once a narrative gives people that coherence, facts bounce off. So where does that leave us? Right in the middle. We don't need to claim Bentov was silenced. We also don't need to dismiss everything associated with his name. What we do need is separation. Accident versus interpretation. Documents versus mythology. Regulation versus transcendence. In the next chapter, we'll look at the CIA document itself, calmly, without drama, and why technical language creates an illusion of depth even when claims stay vague. That's where discernment actually begins. The CIA document, why technical language feels like proof. Let's talk about the document that turns curiosity into conviction. The CIA report often referenced in these stories is real. It exists. It's declassified. And yes, it uses dense technical language about consciousness, perception, and altered states. That alone is enough to flip a mental switch for many people, because most of us were trained with a simple rule. If it's technical and classified, it must be powerful. But that rule is unreliable. Intelligence agencies don't write documents to prove truth. They write documents to explore possibilities, especially during the Cold War. In that era, the logic was brutally simple. If there's even a small chance this could work, we need to understand it before someone else does. That's how you end up with research on psychic espionage, remote viewing, sensory deprivation, consciousness alteration, behavioral influence. Not because it's proven, because ignoring a possibility feels riskier than testing it. Here's the key distinction most videos blur. Exploring a hypothesis is not validating it. The Gateway Process document reads like a brainstorming lab notebook stretched into formal language. It stacks concepts, it borrows metaphors, it connects dots that are not experimentally closed. And technical phrasing does something subtle to the reader's mind. It bypasses skepticism. When you see phrases like frequency modulation, hemispheric synchronization, energy systems, holographic model, your brain relaxes and says, someone smarter than me already checked this. But that's not how intelligence research works. Much of it lives in the space between this might be interesting and this is actionable. That gap is where mythology grows. Another important point, the document does not say consciousness controls reality, individuals can override physics, hidden powers were unlocked. Those conclusions come later, added by interpreters, not authors. What the document really reflects is something far less mystical and far more human, a fascination with attention, perception, and predictability. If you can influence how someone perceives information, you don't need to change reality. You change their model of reality. And that's where the story quietly shifts. The most powerful form of control isn't cosmic, it's cognitive. Frame attention, shape interpretation, reduce noise, increase compliance, no frequencies required. So when people read the CIA document and feel a chill, they're responding less to what's written and more to what it represents. Authority exploring the edges of human perception. That feels like forbidden knowledge. But forbidden doesn't mean correct. It often just means unfinished. In the next chapter, we'll bring this back down to ground level. What actually helps people without myths, without fear, and how nervous system regulation quietly improves judgment, behavior, and yes, financial outcomes. That's where this stops being a story and starts being useful. The part that actually works. Nervous system regulation without the myth. Up to this point, we've been peeling layers off the story. Now we get to the part most people miss, because it's quiet, unglamorous, and doesn't feel revolutionary. But it works. Here's the grounded truth beneath all the language about frequencies, fields, and consciousness. When your nervous system is chronically stressed, your perception narrows, your thinking speeds up, your judgment degrades. This isn't philosophy, it's physiology. A dysregulated nervous system overreacts to noise, misreads threat, seeks certainty too fast, prefers simple explanations, makes impulsive decisions. That's true in relationships, it's true in politics, and it's painfully true with money. People don't make bad financial decisions because they're stupid. They make them because their system is overloaded. Urgency feels like truth. Relief feels like logic. Certainty feels like safety. Now here's where Bentov, stripped of myth, still matters. He was right about one thing that modern neuroscience fully supports. Changing bodily rhythms changes mental states. Slow breathing alters heart rate variability. Heart rate variability affects emotional regulation. Emotional regulation affects decision quality. That's the chain. No earth resonance required. When you sit still, breathe slowly, and reduce sensory input, something predictable happens. Cortisol drops, prefrontal function improves, impulsive loops weaken, attention stabilizes. People then report, I think more clearly. I'm less reactive. I notice patterns I missed before. That doesn't mean they accessed hidden information. It means they stopped drowning in internal noise. And here's the important financial crossover, the quiet one. A regulated nervous system. Waits longer before acting. Tolerates uncertainty better. Resists artificial urgency. Spots emotional manipulation faster. Sticks to long-term plans more consistently. That's why calm people often look smarter. They're not faster, they're less hijacked. This is where many videos go wrong. They take a real effect, improved clarity, and inflate it into a cosmic explanation. But you don't need cosmic power to explain why someone who sleeps better, breathes slower, and reacts less makes better choices. You just need biology. So if we translate the entire Bentov narrative into plain language, it becomes this. Not you tune into the universe, but you stop fighting your own nervous system. Not you escape the control grid, but you stop being predictable under stress. And that shift is powerful, quietly, steadily, over time.